The question is that the amendment be disagreed to. I call the honourable member for Hughes.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased at this hour to rise to speak on the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Bill of 2021 and the other related bills. Deputy Speaker, I've sat here and listened to the debate on this bill for many, many hours. And I've heard nothing other than complete nonsense from both sides of politics during this debate. And not once, Deputy Speaker, not once have we talked anything about costs and benefits. This debate has been wide-ranging. Many speakers have come to the dispatch box in their places and talked about how this bill relates to this net zero approach by 2050. But yet it may be an old-fashioned way of doing things, but I believe, Deputy Speaker, that when we have these proposals and when people come in here, rather than just simply talk about virtue signalling, we should clearly set out what the costs are, what the benefits are, and then argue it out. Is this best for our nation? And yet amongst all the speakers and all the hours on this debate, not once has there been any discussion of cost benefits of a net zero by 2050. Well, Deputy Speaker, I'm going to do something a little bit unusual here in this parliament today and discuss a proper cost-benefit analysis. So what's the cost? What's the damage of this net zero by 2050? Well, Deputy Speaker, an article published 14th of October in the Wall Street Journal talks about the cost, and they've done an estimate for the USA, and I'll quote directly. It says, a new study in Nature finds that a 95% reduction in Americans' carbon emissions by 2050 will annually cost 11.9% of US gross domestic product. To put that in perspective, the total expenditure on Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, that's in the US, came to 11.6% of GDP. The annual cost will rise to $4.4 trillion by 2050. And they break that down in America to $11,300 per person per year in today's dollars. So that's around 15,000 Australian dollars. For a family of three, $45,000 cost per year. For a family of four, $60,000 cost per year in today's dollars. And I think if a true cost-benefit analysis was done in Australia, it would be higher likely than what it was in the USA. So we have the costs at $60,000 per family per year. So what's the benefits? Everyone likes to stand up here and say the government should do something to stop the bad weather. The government should take action on climate change. But they always fail to quantify it. Well, Deputy Speaker, you can actually quantify it. There is a UN climate model called MAGIC, MAGIC.org, where you can put the calculations in. And that has actually been done by Bjorn Lomborg. He has looked at what would the reduction in global temperatures be, assuming this model is correct, and there's a lot of evidence shows that it is running too hot, but let's just assume the model is correct. So if the entire, which he calls the rich world, the USA, the European Union, the UK, Canada, Australia, Japan, also Turkey, etc., if all of those nations went to net zero, not in 2050, if they went to net zero today, and they stayed there to the rest of the century, what would the effect on temperature be? Now, surely this should be the very first thing that we should be asking. What are the benefits of that? Well, the UN's own climate models, Deputy Speaker, show that if all those rich nations, including the US, all the European Union, the UK, Australia, Canada, Japan, the whole lot of us, decided to go to net zero today and held that to 2050, the UN's own model shows that may reduce the global temperature by 2,100 at the end of this century by 0.5 degrees Celsius. So it's the 0.5 degrees Celsius of benefit It's going to cost each family of four the equivalent of $60,000 per year. Now, to me, Mr Deputy Speaker, that sounds like a bad idea. Now, if someone wants to argue those figures and put up alternate numbers, let's go ahead and let's have the debate. But let's just not come into this chamber and debate on virtue signalling and people trying to feel good, Deputy Speaker. So therefore it appears, Deputy Speaker, that I am the only member of this House that is going to call out the nonsense of net zero by 2050. But thankfully, Deputy Speaker, there are still some sensible commentators in the media that are also calling this out. I'd like to quote one of our most senior economists, Mr Terry McCrann, from an article in The Australian just a few days ago. He wrote, "It is really quite extraordinary the way almost the entire political class has declared economic war on their own country, and not just the current 26 million Australians, but all future generations as well." Terry McCrann went on, "They are all united in seeking to attack the Australian economy, plain and simple, to permanently and significantly reduce the standard of living of all present and future Australians. The entire political class has signed up to a national suicide note that that's Terry McCrann, wrote about first with Kevin Rudd's carbon tax by abandoning the use of fossil fuels which have provided plentiful, cheap and reliable power on which not only all economic progress but indeed our very civilisation has been built on." Hear, hear, Terry McCrann. It is good to see that we have some journalists actually speaking and telling the truth. Now, the United Australia Party, Deputy Speaker, we will call this nonsense out. We are not going to sell out our nation's sovereignty to overseas globalist interests just so we can feel good and go around virtue signalling. We are not going to sell out our nation's competitive advantage to the Communist Chinese. How is it possible that we are saying China, who is not attending these talks in Glasgow, along with India and also Russia, China say they can, we'll get to net zero by 2060, but we expect Australia to do it by 2050. To agree to that is to give the Communist Chinese Party an economic, political and military advantage over this nation. That is what everyone in this parliament is doing when they stand up and they engage in groupthink and herd mentality and mindlessly chant net zero by 2050. They are putting this nation at a competitive disadvantage vis-à-vis the Communist Chinese, economically, politically and militarily. And I, for one, Deputy Speaker, am prepared to stand out and say this is a nonsense, this damaged the interests of the Australian nation. And some of the other nonsense we've heard during this debate, Deputy Speaker, about these wonderful job creations all this extra investment in renewables will do. Deputy Speaker, we need to ensure the way to create jobs. First, we have to understand the government does not create jobs. It is entrepreneurs in the private sector. And the secret to that is we have to get our electricity costs, generate that electricity using as least number of resources possible, doing it as a lower cost possibility, so we can give the entrepreneurs of this nation access to low-cost electricity so they can go out and make things and produce things with new ideas. That's how we create jobs. That's how we create wealth creation. But the debates that we've heard in this place reminds me of a story that Milton Friedman once told, when he said he was travelling to an Asian country and he visited a work site where a new canal was being built. He said he was shocked to see that instead of modern equipment, such as tractors and earth movers, he saw thousands of workers with shovels. And he asked the government bureaucrat, why are there so few machines? Why have these workers all got shovels? The government bureaucrat explained, you don't understand. This is a job creation program. To which Milton Friedman replied, I thought you were trying to build a canal. If it's jobs you want, you should give the workers spoons, not shovels. That is the ideology that we have when people come into this chamber and say, we're going to create all these wonderful jobs in the electricity generation sector. Every job we create there, Deputy Speaker, we destroy jobs in the real sector that produces real wealth for this nation. The other thing, Deputy Speaker, during this debate, we've heard about how wonderful all this offshore wind is in Europe at the moment and how wonderful everything is going in Europe. Do those members actually turn the news on or read the papers to see the current disaster that is occurring in Europe? They've put all their eggs in these offshore wind turbines in Europe, and what's happened? The price of energy has gone through the roof there. They are suffering an energy catastrophe this winter in Europe. In this winter in Europe, because of the ideology that we've heard in this chamber, which comes from Europe to start with, there will be many Europeans, the elderly and the low-income earners, that will die because they'll be unable to afford to heat their homes. That is where this ideology leads us. It is the poorest in society, the eldest in our society, that will not be able to afford cheap, reliable energy. And this winter, we will see thousands and thousands of deaths in Europe because of this mad ideology that has taken over the country. Now, Deputy Speaker, there are a few amendments that I would like to move in the consideration in detail and third reading stage. But if we're going to do these policies, whatever these policies are, we have an obligation to the Australian public to spell out what the costs and what the benefits are. And when you do that with clear and calm, rational thinking, instead of using emotive language, emotive thinking, you understand, Deputy Speaker, that these policies are contrary to our nation's interest. They're going to put us at a competitive disadvantage against the Communist Chinese. Money will flow out of this country. We know that China has something like 63% of the market of offshore wind turbines globally. The money will flow out of this country to the Chinese, and that beautiful black coal that runs down our eastern seaboard, Australians will not be able to use that. We will put policies in that will prohibit Australians from using that, but yet we'll be happy to ship it off to China, where they will use it to create low-cost energy and to create goods and services, Deputy Speaker. Our nation is at a crossroads today. We have to decide whether we're going to put Australia's interests first, or we're going to put the interests of the UN globalists, those that we see over in Zurich and Glasgow that will stand up and cheer and want to criticise our nation. We have to decide who we put first. And, Deputy Speaker, as a member of this House, for as long as I continue to be a member of this House, I'll continue to fight for the interests of our nation ahead of UN globalists.